Hello and welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast. Now I want to talk about the fact that Japan has a new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi. She's won the vote quite handily in the end, and I want to talk about how she built together a coalition of herself and another Conservative party, and effectively she's sort of outfoxed the left or kept them out of power, when for a while it looked like there were murmurs that the left might come in, build a new coalition and sort of force the LDP out of office. Now, it's very easy to say this in hindsight, but it always seemed to me a little bit more likely that Sanae Takaichi and the LDP would stay in power, simply because by default they were the largest party, they had 196 seats, and so they only had to agree a coalition with one party, which is what happened in the end. They and Ishin, another Conservative party, agreed a coalition, and between them I believe they have 231 seats, which is just too shy of the 233 you need for a majority in Japan's lower house to form a working majority and to have a government. Whereas in contrast, if the opposition parties wanted to club together, they'd need at least, I think, 3 parties to agree, and that's just so much harder. Just to agree all those compromises, get 3 different heads to agree, to work together, to align policy and handle 3 parties worth of factions and just get to an agreement in time. Whereas Sanae Takaichi obviously only had to agree with one party. And also, if no one can agree, absolutely no one can work together. It's not an ideal situation, but by default Sanae Takaichi would have got in anyway, because if no one agrees a coalition, the LDP would have got in with 196 seats. That would have been painful. As a minority that small, to get any legislation through and get anything done. She would have been very susceptible to confident votes or being derailed at any point with key legislation. It's much better to form a coalition if you could make that work. But by default, she was always more likely than this opposition coalition to get in. But in the end, she managed to make this coalition with another Conservative Party work, and so that will comfortably is what's got her in. I believe she got 237 votes in the vote to make her Prime Minister of Japan, so comfortably she got through with the most votes, versus Noda, who came in second place with 149, so basically only got his own party to vote for him, or close to that. So I want to quickly take you through this process of how Sanae Takaichi became leader of the LDP and how this sort of horse trading coalition process worked. So roughly what I think happened was that Sanae Takaichi won the vote. It looked for a while like Koizumi might be the front runner because he was more liked among actual elected lawmakers, members of the LDP who actually sit in Parliament. But she got more votes from actual members voting supporters of the LDP, so she did quite well there. And because of that, and the fact that Koizumi was sort of diminished by a scandal where apparently someone within his campaign was sending out an email with like a list of like favourable stock compliments to say about Koizumi, that hurt his credibility, made him look a bit vain, image focused, not like a serious candidate, and the fact that it leaked as well doesn't particularly make him look like he's running a good campaign. So all that sort of hurt his image, and in the end, because Sanae Takaichi won with the members, because of Taro Aso, a former Prime Minister and faction leader, like at the last minute swinging his support behind Takaichi, all of that coalesced so that she won the vote and she became the leader of the LDP. Now already there was trouble on the horizon there because Komeito, the long-standing coalition partner of the LDP, was saying beforehand, I think, or they were putting out murmurs that they weren't happy with the idea of Takaichi as the leader, and that they would have perhaps more difficulty working with her. And sure enough, not long after Takaichi was elected, they left the coalition and left her very vulnerable with only 196 seats. Now, as I say, they were potentially unhappy with the idea of working for her, and I believe there's been some sort of statement from within Komeito that they would have been happier working with Ishiba, or that this wouldn't necessarily have happened under Ishiba. But on paper, I think what the reason they cited was the fact that they weren't seeming that willing to work on like reform the LDP. They weren't that willing to put through sort of finance reform, and so that's the reason Komeito left. In any case, those 20 or so seats left the coalition, left her very vulnerable, so she had to effectively go out and find a new coalition partner. Now, it was at this time that it looked like there was a serious possibility of the opposition coming in and sort of foxing her out, because there was a rumour that there was talks between Noda, the leader of the CDP, who had around 148 seats, I think, and the DPFP and Ishin. Now, that coalition would have, I think, a coalition that would have been more than 196 the LDP had, so that would have got them a government, effectively. And what it looked like the proposal was that Tamaki, the leader of the DPFP, would have been the leader of that coalition, which is slightly surprising as he's the leader of the smallest party, but it does kind of make sense because he's more of a centrist. He's never been in government as a prime minister before. He's never been PM. So you could argue he sort of represents a sort of a middle ground between CDP more on the left and Ishin on the right as a Conservative Party, and also it allows him to represent himself as sort of a fresh start, never having been PM before. But that sort of fell apart relatively early on because it looked like basically he wasn't willing to seriously consider talks. He made a statement to that effect unless certain key policies were agreed, and they did then, after he made that statement, sort of re-enter talks. But that sort of lost them the momentum and sort of being seen as the most likely coalition to form. And at some point after this, Ishin, or perhaps they were entering sort of parallel talks the whole time. It's hard to know the timeline of this. But anyway, at some point, Ishin entered talks with the LDP. They were able to come to an agreement, and that sort of killed off the prospect of this sort of left-wing coalition coming in and taking the LDP out of power. Now, I also saw at one point a rumour, and I haven't been able to substantiate this, so this could purely be a Twitter rumour, that there was some within the CDP who were considering Komeito to possibly come into the coalition, which would have been quite a turnaround because they were in coalition with the LDP for so long, and they were elected thinking that they would enter coalition and form a government with them once again. This could have, just, like I say, just purely been a Twitter rumour. Now, whether this was seriously happening, and it was a serious prospect, who knows? It could have been happening potentially, but then maybe the fact that Ishin were entering serious negotiations with the LDP killed that prospect, because between them, Ishin and LDP have so many votes that no other coalition could form, and so that just stopped the prospect of that. Or maybe it never happened and it was purely a rumour, who knows? But the fact that Ishin and LDP were able to come to this deal really locked in Sanae Takaichi as forming the new government. It meant that she could succeed Ishiba, who resigned, and come in and become the new PM, and that's now what's happened. And so maybe you could argue that Tamaki's sort of not played his hand well here, because maybe if he'd been more willing to compromise, more willing to negotiate, he could have perhaps locked Ishin and CDP in the coalition, or it could have been that Ishin were always going to talk to the LDP anyway. Who knows? To form a devil's advocate point of view, maybe he hasn't done that badly, Tamaki, because small parties who enter a coalition, even if he was the PM and the leader of the coalition, they often suffer. And so maybe he was wise to sort of insist on certain key policy concessions before entering negotiations, just to make sure he got them. Just so that if it all fell apart and the coalition didn't do particularly well, at least he could go back to his constituents in the next election and say, okay, I compromised on a lot of things, I entered a coalition that perhaps didn't work out as well as it could have, but at least I got you these key things which I promised you, and I've secured those for you. Whereas it might have been a very tantalising and appealing prospect to become the PM, obviously for Tamaki, but if he doesn't get those key concessions, and if the coalition didn't work out well, maybe he would be punished as sort of the smaller party in the face of the coalition. And this is just looking to the future and speculating, but often smaller parties and coalitions do suffer. So maybe he was sort of wary of being the face of a very fragile coalition and getting nothing for his party, having no tangible gains to say to his supporters, see, I got this for you. So maybe that's why he was a bit reluctant. So you could argue that's wise, and he was afraid of being tainted by being in a weak coalition. But in the end, he has lost out because he had, you could argue, a very tangible opportunity if they'd negotiated this coalition to come into government and sweep the LDP out of power. But by insisting on those conditions and not being more flexible and compromising, he's lost an opportunity there. Who knows whether that's true or not, and if this coalition would have been possible or not. But you could argue the left and centrist parties here have missed a trick, and they've sort of lost out to the Conservative parties who had their ducks in a row, sat down to negotiate quicker and hammered out this agreement in time to secure their new government. So maybe they've played their hands better in that respect. Now, really, only time will tell if Tamaki made the right call. It might be because he's played it safe and insisted on these certain things. He's stayed out of government, and so his hands are effectively clean. He won't be tainted by a struggling government that's going to face a lot of issues. things like a rice crisis, having to deal with the cost of living, inflation in Japan, and so he can sort of stay out of it, stay on the sidelines and say, well, I want these, idealistic things, I want to deliver this and this, but by not actually being in government, that makes it easier for him to be in opposition and say, well, if I would do this and this, and it sort of keeps his image clean by not having to compromise and be in government. Whereas in contrast, it'll be interesting to see if that will be rewarded, if he will get more votes in the next election of having stayed out and missed his opportunity to form a government, or how Ishin's move to go into coalition with the LDP will be received. Will they suffer for being the minor party in the coalition? Will they suffer, as arguably Komeito have, over the years by being in LDP and losing votes and their leader being unseated in the past? Will Ishin similarly suffer as a result of having to compromise and be in a difficult government and making the tough decisions? So it'll be interesting to see who comes out in the end and who's proven to be right in that call. And the Ishin leader, Yoshimura, made a statement sort of hinting at this and hinting at the fact that there's a possibility his party might suffer, but he's making sort of arguably the tougher grown-up choice, because I suppose you could argue that someone has to, take the hit, form a coalition, compromise, if you're going to have a stable government. Because of the way the election fell in 2024, no party has an outright majority. So if Japan's going to have a stable government, someone has to compromise and enter into a coalition and make sort of arguably the tougher choice of being tainted by being in government and having to negotiate and not get everything they want. And often those coalition parties do suffer. But arguably, if you're going to have a stable government in Japan, someone has to do it. So you could make an argument that he's doing sort of the difficult thing, but maybe the thing that's better for Japan if they're going to want a stable government. So his statement, and it's translated, but roughly it goes along these lines. I'm heading to Tokyo to reach an agreement on forming a coalition government together with the new president Takaichi. We will move forward, politics forward for the future of Japan. I understand that from the party's perspective, there is risk involved. However, unless someone takes that risk, the stagnant Japan will not find a way forward. For the sake of Japan, to fulfill our promises and to advance society, I will take a step forward. That's approximately what he said. So very much hinting that he's doing sort of arguably the difficult thing, whereas he could have stayed out of government and stayed on the sidelines and said, oh, aren't LDP or aren't this new coalition who's formed, aren't they doing a terrible job? And sort of kept his hands clean in that respect. So anyway, that's how this new coalition government was formed. And so it's sort of now to ask, what does Sanae Takaichi and what does this Ishin LDP government mean for Japan? What can we expect from them? Well, in terms of Sanae Takaichi, she's always been sort of a follower of Abe. She's been closely associated with Abe, and she was appointed to many posts by him and worked with him for years. He was a supporter of her in one of her early runs when she ran for the head of the LDP before, and she's seen as sort of the successor to Abe. So arguably, given that Japan's got a bit of a cost of living crisis and issues relating to inflation, she might again pursue Abenomics. That's possibly what you can expect to sort of help Japan's economy, the approach she'll take, sort of taking on more debt. So she'll take on this debt in order to sort of stimulate the economy and invest directly in the economy that way and hope to grow it. So it'll be interesting to see if she'll pursue sort of an Abenomic economic policy to try and sort of get Japan out of its stagnation and sort of make the economy a bit healthier. She's also wants to, you would imagine, stop votes from the right flowing to new populist parties like Sanzeto, and she ran her campaign talking about issues like over-touristification, the bad behaviour of tourists, concerns about immigration in terms of people like overstaying their visas and things like that, and she even talked about setting up a new ministry to address these sort of issues. So you can expect some sort of development to address how tourists behave, the amount of tourists coming into the country, concerns about people buying up land who come in from overseas, things like that. So you can expect her to take some sort of populist moves to sort of address those concerns and prevent votes going to parties like Sanzeto and looking to them for solutions for this sort of immigration issue. In terms of the negative, I would say Sanae Takaichi being in power likely means that reform on separate surnames for married couples, so couples being able to have different surnames while being married, is probably effectively dead for the near future. That's probably not going to happen. She may do some sort of thing like recognise the use of nicknames or marital names as a sort of something you can use, but it's not your legal name. So let people use their maiden names, even if it's not technically their legal name, may come in as a sort of a reform. But in terms of married couples being able to have legally separate surnames, I think reform in that area is probably not going to happen, just because Sanae Takaichi's been against it for so long. and it was always going to be a contentious issue to get through Parliament in Japan anyway. For similar reasons, I imagine reform to allow same-sex marriage likely won't happen in the near future as well. For similar reasons, it's against what Takaichi's talked about in the past. And now it's worth, I think, looking at what Ishin will want, because arguably they've made the sacrifice of coming into a coalition and joining with the LDP. What will they ask for? Well, I won't go through their full list. There's a list that's been sort of going around of 12 demands that Ishin made. I won't go through it in full, but I want to pick out a few of these sort of interesting things. So sort of the two headline things that I've seen getting a lot of media attention, and that might be sort of the top of the list potentially in order for Ishin to say these are our priorities. The two I've seen talked about a lot are, number one, reduction of the number of seats by around 10% in Japan's parliament. Now that's going to be a very contentious issue, because for a big party like the LDP, that potentially means if you lose 10%, depending on how that is implemented, that means you lose a number of your members. So for 196 LDP members, that means 19 or so of your colleagues should be going. You can imagine there might be some pushback, some resentment about that. And also it all means like there are potentially lots of other parties within Japan's parliament who might be reticent or reluctant about that, depending on how it's implemented. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. It will also be interesting if it would hurt smaller parties larger than larger parties, because Japan has a sort of a two-tier system in terms of its elections, where some members are voted based on a local district, and some are voted on based on sort of a regional percentage vote. So the more amount of a percentage of the vote you get, the more MP members you get elected into Japan's Diet. So you'll get more members elected in a region if you get, say, 20-30%, so big parties like LDP or the CDP, those sort of numbers, or 10-20%. Whereas smaller parties that are getting in 3, 4, 5% of the vote in a region, if there's less MPs to go around, less people being elected into Japan's parliament, perhaps they'll lose out more often if there's a restriction in the amount in each region based on how this potential reduction in the amount of people elected in Japan's Diet's implemented. So it'd be interesting to see if sort of smaller populist parties that are breaking through, like Sanzeto or Reiwa, for instance, if they might lose out to sort of larger parties that are getting higher percentage votes if there's going to be a reduction based on how it's implemented. That's purely my speculation, but we'll have to see the detail on this, and it'll be interesting what level of pushback and resistance that measure gets. Another big thing they've asked for is campaign finance reform, effectively restricting or blocking how corporations or institutions donate to politicians, and to just sort of clean up politics and finance in politics in that respect. Now that's going to be very difficult and very painful for the LDP. This is an issue that's very much hurt their image, because that is what cost them their majority, arguably. There was a big scandal relating to a slush fund. So funds that weren't properly declared by the LDP, that were sort of sitting in accounts to be used by them in terms of election expenses, but there were sort of allegations that this money was sitting there and being used improperly and not properly declared. And there was also a church scandal relating to the LDP, where they were receiving support from like a controversial church, allegedly, for the LDP. So to target that could potentially be painful. There might be some elements within the LDP who don't want to address that, who don't want this reform. And it also, you could make an argument that maybe this is a good thing for the LDP in some ways, because this has really hurt their image in the past. For example, Shigeru Ishiba, the previous Prime Minister, was elected in partially because he was seen as an outsider of the Abe faction. He wasn't tainted by this scandal, and he sort of pitched himself as sort of a maverick, someone who's going to come in, clean up the image of the LDP. He's an outsider from this scandal, he's not hurt by it as much, and he's going to reform and clean up the LDP's image, was part of his appeal. But despite that, he was debatably seen as not doing it. It wasn't seen as enough that you just voted in an outsider from the Abe, outside of the Abe faction, who says these things about reform, because he immediately, or not long after he was voted in, he lost the party's majority in the lower house, and that was partly, I think, because of loss of trust in the LDP and the fact they were hurt by these scandals. And then in the future election, he was also lost their majority in the upper house. So despite the fact they elected in this reformer, this outsider who wasn't as hurt as much by these scandals, it still perhaps hasn't quite broken through and helped the party's image, and they're perhaps seen as still having a problem in this area and being hurted by this scandal. So maybe if there was a serious effort to sort of clean out the money out of politics and reform it, that might help the LDP in the long run to get rid of that sort of scandals association with them, get rid of this perception of them, and make them seem as more reformers. So although it will hurt in the short term, perhaps there's an argument it might help them in the long term if they were to take this seriously, do some real reform. Although it may be painful, there may be some pushback within the party to this to get it through. But I suppose the difficult thing for this might be that even if they do it, it might be seen that they only did it because Ishin effectively demanded it and pushed it into them. So they'll have to be very delicate about how that's handled. Because if the LDP is seen as wanting to maintain the system they had before and not clean up, but Ishin came in and made them do it in order to stay in government, that might not help their image. They might not get the associated credit for that, while also having all the pain and the difficulty and the pushback of putting this through the parliament. So it'll be interesting to see how that's put through in practice. Apart from that, Ishin have demanded a number of other things. They've asked for tax cuts, specifically on food, so that might be a positive thing in terms of if it can be put through the budget, if money can be found, that might be good to help address the rice crisis. And certainly that will be towards the top of Sanae Takaichi's inbox, because this is a continuing issue, the cost of rice being higher, being difficult for families to find and afford rice. And Ishiba made some steps to try and address that, but if Sanae Takaichi can be seen as the one of getting that over the line and maybe succeeding where Ishiba wasn't in the end fully successful in addressing this crisis, maybe that will be to her benefit. And so perhaps a measure like this to lower the cost of food in general will help. So maybe that's something she might be amenable to in accordance with what Ishin want. And there's also a more general request for tax cuts in other areas. So it'll be interesting to see if Sanae Takaichi will be amenable to go along with that, if that's something she has in mind, and if she can find sort of the room to do that, and also the sort of the Abenomics and stimulating the economy through direct investment by taking on debt, if she wants to do both at the same time, and if she feels both can work in her budget. So in the end, I think it will be very interesting which of these 12 points that Ishin prioritised first, what are most agreeable to the LDP, and just generally in practice how well this coalition works. And it will be very interesting to see how long these two will be able to work together and how fractious it is, and will it work well just because these two are sort of both conservatives, both of the right, and will they have made the right choice in working together in the long run to secure this coalition and sort of box out the sort of the centrists and the left-wing parties who are sort of looking to maybe come in and replace them as a coalition, and how healthy this coalition will be very interesting to watch over the next few months and years. And it'll be interesting to see how well it benefits Ishin at the next election, which you imagine could potentially be not too far away. You can imagine that perhaps this coalition doesn't see out the full term, either because it does well or because it does badly. In either case, you imagine both parties will have, in the not too distant future, the idea of an election in mind. But that's just purely my speculation. And so it'll be interesting to see how it works out in the long run. But yeah, that really sums up what's happened so far, and it's interesting to now see these two working together and Sanae Takaichi come in as Japan's new Prime Minister and the first ever female Prime Minister. But yeah, that sums up the show, guys. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. Sayonara, goodbye.